What was your thought process there in using that interview in particular? Because he's done so many interviews over the years, and this is obviously when he was younger, during his wrestling days.
Yeah, it was kind of the height of him in wrestling, and he wasn't like over the top. You know, he's very thoughtful, and to me, Sally Jessy Raphael just kind of represents the 1980s too. You know, she was such a 1980s figure, and he reps the 80s, and I thought it was she asked very good questions. There was a lot of introspection there, you know, asking about his family and growing up, and then there were some really cool moments, you know, and you see in the film when one of the audience members says, "Isn't wrestling scripted, fake moves?" and Rick goes, "No, it's not," and gets kind of offended at it, and it shows you that they tried to protect the business back then. It was a different time period. So I think it just kind of takes you back to that time, which is what I like about it. As far as you know, he didn't do a lot of non-wrestling interviews back then. Back in the mid-1980s, he wasn't on many national shows, so it was pretty cool to get.
Rory, when you had a thought process going into this and who you wanted to interview and what you wanted to do with Ric Flair, did you learn anything after this whole process was done?
Sure. I mean, I'm always learning things, you know, when I get the privilege to make these films. And, you know, I just think that, you know, I learned some more specific things, like he slept with 10,000 women. I mean, that was kind of shocking and impressive at the same time, and just also learning about, you know, Rick has a saying, "You got to pay the price," and that was what he used to say in his promos. And I think there's always a price for greatness, and you see it with anything. If you want to be great at something, you're going to have to sacrifice and pay that price. And I think it's evident when you watch the film what he did. And also, too, he touches on this, as do a couple other people. You know, Rick says, "I always wanted to be the man. I could never live with just being a man." And, you know, especially now in society, being the man is so revered. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Like, who has the most bling, who's got, you know, who can stay out the longest, who's got the biggest house. And on social media, it's always, look at all the stuff I've got. And that's our culture right now. I think that's why he's so popular today. But, you know, a man is the guy who takes his kids to school, picks up his kids from the carpool line, which I just did. And let me tell you something, when you're picking your kids up, you know, nobody's patting you on the back or cheering for you, or, you know, there's not tons of girls there waiting for you. I mean, it's a very kind of mundane activity, but at the same time, it's a very fulfilling activity. And I think Rick could not be fulfilled by such things. You know, his first wife in the film says he hated being home. You know, I know, speaking for myself, when I would travel, I would love being home. So it's like something was missing there with him. There was a void that he was trying to fill. I found that very interesting.
And speaking of that void, it's interesting you were able to speak to his first wife. His kids opened up. There were a lot of personal elements there, and Rick has gone through his ups and downs in his personal life, which you do show. Were there any thoughts of getting a psychologist on to talk about some of the things Rick did and why he may have done them?
Yeah, we interviewed a psychologist. She just didn't make the film. I'm ahead of you there. I went for that. But it wasn't like, at the end of the day, it wasn't his therapist. I mean, you know, so it's like anyone can kind of sit on the sidelines and try to evaluate stuff. And at the same time, I'd like the audience to kind of decide on things. I don't like to do something and say, this is how you should think and feel about someone. You know, aren't they great or aren't they terrible? I think, you know, in this film, people will walk away and two people can think two completely different things about Rick. And I think that's good. It's like your favorite song. You know, two people can listen to the same song and get something completely different out of it.
Rory, did you have any thoughts too or maybe you did interview them then, of interviewing some of the wrestling historians like a Bill Apter or George Napolitano, or even some of the bigger name dirt sheet writers about him and about the business?
We did. We interviewed some of those guys, not the ones you mentioned, but we interviewed Dave Meltzer and Wade Keller and Jason Powell, and they just didn't make the film. They were very good, very good. But I decided to go with some other non-wrestling media members like Marty Smith, Shel Beadle, and Maria Menounos, only because they spoke more like fans, which is what I was looking for in that section, what we were looking for. And, those guys, they do it for a living, analyzing wrestling. They're much more analytical about it, which they should be. So it just didn't fit. But we did go down that route.
And that's curious, too, because you mentioned that part of it. Because you had people that worked at ESPN or had worked at ESPN, whether it be a Todd Grisham, a Max Britos, and a Jonathan Coachman, who also had worked for WWE. So again, I didn't know if you had gone down that road, or does it go back to you wanted to stay away from the wrestling side from their perspective?
It's not that. It's like, with someone like Ric Flair, who wrestled for like 40 years, you could interview the world. You could do 500 interviews, and I'm not exaggerating, but you got to just make choices. And a lot of people, especially broadcasters, they're going to say the same stuff. They're going to get repetitive after a while, and they have similar stories about them. So, you make choices. I interviewed Tony Schiavone, and I felt like he was a commentator. We had Jim Ross. They kind of knew him more on a personal level, and they kind of went back with him a little bit, versus people that didn't know him that well. And most of the people that we interviewed that didn't really know him that well, those were the people that didn't necessarily make the film, or maybe they didn't know him for that long. Like, they're friendly with him now, today, but it's really in the last 10 years. So, hey, man, there's tough choices, and we interviewed some good people. Like Mick Foley, Eric Bischoff, Jim Harbaugh, when we interviewed, and they just didn't make the film, and it has nothing to do with them being compelling interviews. They all were. They were great, and they were gracious, but, when you're putting one of these things together, it's about